The Cubs founded a government at 400. Hours. Let me back up because I know how that sounds. You're sitting there thinking, I've finally lost it after 20 years in station security. But I'm telling you, my colleagues, I watched 12 Predator Cubs establish a complete governmental system with executive branches, judicial oversight, and diplomatic protocols in less than 6 rotations. And it all started because a human brought a mirror to work. Her name was Devon, and she cut hair. I need you to understand what that means. This human, this creature from a death world where everything tries to kill you. And they decided to domesticate it all. Anyway, had a job that involved making other beings look prettier. She carried scissors sharp enough to cut through whole plating, but she used them to trim fur. She had steady hands that could probably defuse a bomb, but she spent her days doing braids for the station administrator. When the Cubs arrived, nobody knew what to do with them. 12 orphaned predator, young, fresh from a pack accident, quadrupedal and furred with fangs still growing in and claws they hadn't learned to retract yet. They howled at shift changes. They tried to hunt the maintenance drones. Station Administrator Kesha nearly had a breakdown trying to find someone, anyone, willing to supervise creatures that might eat them. Devon volunteered. Of course she did. The human who faced down plasma scissors and chemical straightening treatments every day decided that 12 apex predator children were a reasonable addition to her schedule. She showed up at the Cubs' quarters on Cycle 4 with a rolling case full of her equipment set up in the corner like she was opening a salon, and told Kesha she'd watch them between her afternoon appointments. I should have known something was wrong when the Cubs stopped howling. You have to understand, these Cubs had not been quiet since they arrived. They cried for their pack. They cried when they were hungry. They cried when they weren't hungry but thought they might be later. My junior guard then filed 8 noise complaints before I told him that filing reports wouldn't make traumatized children stop grieving. But 3 hours after Devon arrived, the Cubs went silent. Not distressed, silent, not scared. Silent, focused, silent. I pulled up the security feed because focused silence from 12 predators is how people die, and that's when I saw it. Devon had set up a large rectangular mirror, the kind humans used to see themselves while they perform grooming rituals. She was showing the Cubs their own reflections. They were mesmerized. All 12 of them sat in a semicircle, completely still except for their tails, watching themselves in the mirror like it was broadcasting the secrets of the universe. Devon moved around behind them, gently brushing their fur, and every few moments one of the Cubs would tilt its head and watch its reflection tilt back. I thought, fine, that's clever, keep them distracted. Let them look at themselves. Children like looking at themselves. Right, wrong. So catastrophically wronged. At 400 hours the next morning, my comm unit screamed me awake with an emergency alert from the Cubs' quarters. I ran 7 corridors in my sleep clothes, certain I'd find blood and chaos and at least 3 lawsuits. Instead, I found 12 Cubs standing at attention in 2 perfect rows facing the mirror. They were standing guard, not playing guard, not pretending, actually standing watch with shift rotations and alert postures and what I can only describe as patrol routes. As I watched, 2 Cubs broke formation. marched to opposite ends of the mirror, turned and marched back. The others didn't move, didn't even twitch. Devon was asleep on a cushion in the corner, her scissors case serving as a pillow. I contacted then, who arrived looking as confused as I felt. We stood there for 20 minutes watching the cubs perform what appeared to be actual military drills. When one cub's attention wavered, another chirped sharply and the first snapped back to focus. Devon woke up stretched and wandered over to check her reflection in the mirror. All 12 cubs immediately shifted to flank her, forming a protective corridor. Morning Vrexel, she said like this was normal, like she woke up surrounded by armed child soldiers every day. Did you need something? What? I said carefully. Are they doing? Oh, she glanced at the cubs who were still in formation. They're protecting the other side, those 3 words, my friends, were the beginning of the end of my sanity. Devon explained in the same tone she used to describe hair products that the cubs had discovered their reflections yesterday and decided that the creatures in the mirror were real, separate entities, other cubs who needed protection. They think their reflections are different. Cubs then asked. They know their reflections, Devon corrected, but they've decided to treat them as a separate group anyway. It's like playing pretend, but they're really committed to it. Playing pretend. The cubs had organized themselves into a military structure with watches and rotations, and she thought they were playing. I tried to explain this to her. The cubs weren't playing, they were exhibiting concerning behavioral patterns. This level of organization suggested either hive mind tendencies or pack bonding so intense it might be dangerous. Devon looked at me with those human eyes, the ones that evolved to track prey across distances that would make our ancestors weep, and said, or just really into it. The cubs refused to leave their posts. We tried everything. We brought food, they ignored it. We brought toys, they ignored those too. One cub would briefly break formation to eat, then immediately return to its position they had assigned themselves. Shifts, somehow communicating who watched when without making a sound. Kesha arrived at 800 hours, demanding to know why her security feeds showed 12 cubs performing military exercises. They're guarding the other side, I told her, because my life had become something I no longer recognized. Kesha stared at the cubs stared at the mirror. Devon was teaching one of them how to fluff its tail properly. The other side of what? Keisha asked. The mirror. I watched Keisha's 3 eyes try to process this. She was a Vandorian administrator with 2 advanced degrees and 15 years of station management experience. She had successfully negotiated trade disputes between species who couldn't breathe the same atmosphere. She had once talked down an armed freighter captain using only bureaucratic procedure citations. She looked at the cubs, looked at Devon, looked at me and said, I'm going to need a report. That's when Devon did something impossible. She pulled a second mirror from her equipment case, this one smaller and circular, and set it up at an angle to the first mirror. The reflections multiplied, bouncing back and forth between the surfaces, creating what looked like an infinite corridor of cubs stretching into forever. The cubs went absolutely silent. Then, in perfect unison, they turned to look at Devon. She smiled at them, made a complex gesture with her hands that looked like nothing so much as a formal greeting, and said, "Congratulations. You just made interdimensional allies." The cubs exploded into motion, not chaotic motion, organized motion. They split into groups, establishing new patrol routes that incorporated both mirrors. They began moving in synchronized patterns, timing their movements so their reflections moved in harmony. 3 cubs positioned themselves at the angle point between mirrors, apparently serving as communication hubs. Devon made another hand gesture. The cubs paused, watched, then began making small chirping sounds in a rhythmic pattern. "What," Kasha whispered, "is happening?" "Mirror sign language," Devon said cheerfully, brushing out another cub's fur. "If they're going to coordinate with their reflections, they need a way to communicate across dimensions, right?" The cubs were responding to the reflections, actually responding as if receiving orders, as if the reflections were giving them instructions. They would watch the mirror make their chirping sounds, then adjust their positions based on what they saw. Devon made a different gesture. Every cub in the room sat down simultaneously. "How?" I asked, hearing my voice crack slightly. "Are you doing that?" She shrugged, human casual in a way that made my fur stand on end. "They watch the mirror, see themselves, copy what I do, think their reflections are sending signals back. Basic communication through observation." "Basic," she called it basic, then pulled me aside, his voice low. "Chief, they're not just playing anymore. They're demonstrating actual strategic thinking, formation patterns, communication protocols. This isn't normal cub behavior." I knew that. I had watched cubs develop. For 30 years they played. Yes, they roughhoused and explored and got into everything, but they didn't organize. They didn't create systems. Devon's commune chimed. She glanced at it, sighed, and started packing up her scissors. "I've got a 900 appointment. Kesa, you needed that trim, right?" Kesa touched her head crest reflexively. "I can reschedule." "Don't be silly." Devon stood addressing the cubs in that same cheerful tone. "Guard shift change in 1 hour. Maintain diplomatic protocols with the other side." Every single cub chirped in acknowledgement. Devon left. The cubs continued their patrol, and I stood there watching 12 predator children follow orders that a hairstylist had given them while pretending to coordinate with infinite mirror dimensions, wondering when exactly my life had become completely incomprehensible. That was 6 hours ago. The cubs still haven't broken formation. I tried to remove the mirrors at 1400 hours. This was a mistake that will haunt me for the rest of my career, colleagues. Mistake that resulted in what I can only describe as a coordinated military response from 12 cubs who had apparently spent the morning developing contingency plans. The moment Thren and I entered their quarters with the intention of dismantling Devon's mirror setup, all 12 cubs moved to block us, not aggressive. Mind you, they didn't bare fangs or raise claws. They simply positioned themselves between us and the mirrors in a defensive formation that would have made a tactical instructor weep with pride. "Cubs," I said in my most authoritative voice, the one that makes junior guards stand straighter, step aside. They didn't move. One cub, slightly larger than the others, made a complex series of chirps. The others responded in harmony. Then They sat down, completely blocking our path and refused to budge. There. Staging a protest, then whispered. They're staging a coup, I corrected. We tried for 20 minutes, we brought treats, we brought toys, we brought a maintenance drone program to make entertaining sounds. The cubs ignored everything, maintaining their barrier with a discipline that most of my guards couldn't match after training. That's when they started howling, not distress. Howls, alarm howls, the kind that say intruders in the den and threat to the pack. Within 3 minutes I had 17 noise complaints and Kesha demanding to know why I was terrorizing children. I called Devon. She answered on the second chime, and I could hear the sound of running water in the background. Hey Rexel, what's up? The cubs won't let us remove the mirrors. Well, yeah, you're trying to destroy their diplomatic infrastructure. Would you let someone demolish your office? I stood there holding my comm unit, watching 12 cubs maintain a perfect defensive perimeter and tried to figure out how to explain that mirrors were not diplomatic infrastructure. Devon, I said carefully, they're mirrors. To you, they're mirrors to the cubs. They're portals to Allied territory. Context matters, Vrexel. She talked me through the door. Literally through the door, because I had backed out of the quarters to make the call and the cubs had barricaded themselves inside. She explained that if I wanted to move the mirrors, I needed to frame it as a territorial negotiation rather than hostile action. Tell them you're proposing a relocation of diplomatic facilities for mutual security benefit, she said. I'm not telling children that. Then enjoy your standoff. I told them exactly that, using Devon's words, feeling my dignity evaporate with each syllable. The cubs considered this. They chirped among themselves, glanced at their reflections as if consulting them, then moved aside, then stared at me. That worked. I don't want to talk about it. We didn't remove the mirrors. We left them exactly where they were, and I filed a report that made Kesha summon xenotoxicologist. Dr. Hinth arrived at 1600 hours carrying enough scanning equipment to analyze a small moon. He was a Therian specialist in developmental cognition with credentials that covered an entire data pad screen and a reputation for publishing papers that made other scientists reconsider their careers. He took one look at the cubs and their mirrors, and I watched his career reconsider him. They're performing synchronized movements, he muttered, adjusting his scanner, following patrol patterns, maintaining shift rotations. He looked up at me. How long has this been happening? 16 hours, impossible. Cubs this young can't maintain focus for 16 hours. Their neural development doesn't allow for sustained attention beyond brief intervals. I gestured at the cubs who were absolutely maintaining focus, following routes around both mirrors with geometric precision. Hinth ran every test he had: cognition, assessment, spatial reasoning, evaluations, pattern recognition, protocols. The cubs treated each test like a diplomatic function, sitting politely while Hinth waved scanners and displays at them, then returning immediately to their duties. Off the charts, Hinth whispered, staring at his data pad. Every single measurement, spatial reasoning that exceeds adult averages, strategic thinking that matches trained military personnel, command structure complexity that rivals some governmental systems. Is that concerning? Then asked. Concerning, it's impossible. Henth pulled up more data. These cubs are demonstrating cognitive abilities. They shouldn't develop for another 8 years. They're organizing themselves, using conceptual frameworks that require abstract thinking most species don't achieve until adolescence. Devon arrived at 1700 hours for what she called evening grooming session. The cubs broke formation immediately, swarming her with excited chirps, and I watched Henth's brain try to process 12 suddenly playful children who had been military serious 3 seconds earlier. They're children, Devon said when Henth tried to explain his findings. Children are smart, you just have to give them something interesting to think about. She set up her grooming station, and the cubs lined up, actually lined up in order, waiting their turns like they'd done this 1,000 times. Devon worked through them methodically, brushing out fur, checking claws, cleaning behind ears, and she used the mirror. See, she said to one cub, turning its head to show the reflection. Much better, very handsome. The cub chirped happily, then paused, staring at its reflection. It tilted its head, the reflection tilted back. Cub made a small gesture with one paw. The reflection copied it, then the cub turned to Devon and made a different gesture entirely. Oh, you want the diplomatic style, Devon said. That's going to take some special brushing. She worked for 20 minutes, creating what I can only describe as an elaborate fur pattern on the cub's back. When she finished, she turned the cub to face the mirror. The cub stared at itself, made a series of rapid chirps, and every other cub in the room responded in harmony. What, Henth said faintly, just happened. Rank insignia, Devon explained, moving to the next cub. They've decided different grooming styles represent different positions in their government. That one wanted the security chief pattern. They have ranks now. They've had ranks since this morning. Keep up, Doc. Henth ran more scans. The cubs continued their grooming appointments. Devon worked through all 12, and each one requested a different style. Each one resulted in different chirp patterns. From the group, they're using visual markers as identifiers, Henth said, his voice getting higher. They're creating a hierarchical system based on aesthetic differences. They're developing cultural practices. They're getting haircuts, Devon said. Over the next 6 hours, we watched the cubs do something that I still don't have adequate words for. They began practicing with data pads, the ones we'd given them for educational games, but instead of games, they were making marks, scratching symbols into the surfaces with their claws. What are they writing? Kasia asked, arriving for her evening inspection. Henth examined the data pads, his eyes getting wider with each one. Reports. They're filing incident reports. Each one documents a border breach. He looked up. They're recording every time their reflections move unexpectedly. Every time someone walks past the mirror, every environmental change. They're maintaining logs. Military logs, Thren added quietly. The cubs weren't playing anymore. Or they were playing, but they'd made the game so complex, so detailed, so thoroughly organized that it had stopped resembling play and started resembling actual governance. One cub approached Kao directly, carrying a data pad in its mouth. It said the pad at her feet, chirped formally, and returned to formation. Kesha picked up the data pad. Her crest went rigid. This is a request form, a properly formatted request form for Embassy status. Embassy status, I repeated. They want their quarters officially designated as sovereign territory representing the other side allied nations. They've included proposed boundaries, security requirements, and diplomatic protocols. Henth grabbed the data pad. This is 43 pages. They've written 43 pages of governmental documentation in less than 20 hours. Devin finished grooming the last cub. Sounds about right. They've been pretty focused. How are they doing this? Kasia demanded. Devin cleaned her brushes unconcerned. Same way children do anything. They watch, they learn, they expand on it. You give them structure, they build on it. The mirror gives them a framework for understanding organization and cooperation. They're just running with it. Running with it, Henth echoed. They're not running with it, they're revolutionizing our understanding of accelerated cognitive development. A chime from the main station comm interrupted us. Kasia answered, listened, and her crest flattened completely against her skull. Senior behavioral specialist Quorm is arriving tomorrow, she said. She wants to observe the cubs personally. Quorm. Henth's voice cracked. Professor Quorm, she wrote the definitive text on Predator Youth Development. She's bringing a team. We all turned to look at the cubs. They had returned to their positions, maintaining their watch over the mirrors, performing their duties with unwavering dedication. As we watched, two cubs exchanged positions in perfect synchronization, their movements mirrored exactly by their reflections. One cub was scratching new symbols on a data pad, another was teaching a third a complex series of gestures, a fourth was sitting absolutely still, apparently just watching, but its eyes tracked everything with disturbing intelligence. Devin packed up her equipment. Same time tomorrow. The cubs have requested you as permanent diplomatic liaison, Kasia said weakly. Cool. Does it pay extra? I watched her leave, watched the cubs maintain their impossible organization, watched Henth frantically compile his findings, and wondered how a hairstylist had accidentally taught 12 cubs to build a civilization in less than one rotation. Tomorrow, Quorm would arrive with her team and her equipment and her decades of expertise. I had a feeling it wouldn't help. Professor Quorm arrived with enough equipment to study an entire planet. I'm not exaggerating, colleagues. She brought sensor arrays, behavioral monitoring systems, neural scanners, 3 assistant researchers, and what appeared to be a mobile laboratory, compressed into 17 cargo containers. She set up in the observation room, adjacent to the cubs' quarters, and proceeded to treat our station like her personal research facility. I need complete access, she announced. Not even looking at me, 24-hour monitoring, no interference with natural behaviors. Where are the subjects? The cubs are in their quarters, I said. But they're not exactly exhibiting natural behaviors anymore. We'll see. Oh, we all saw, and I don't think any of us will ever unsee it. Quorm's team spent the first hour installing cameras, setting up sensors, calibrating equipment. The cubs watched this happening with what I can only describe as professional interest. They didn't disrupt the installation. They simply adjusted their patrol routes to accommodate the new equipment, then incorporated the cameras into their existing security infrastructure. Adaptive behavior. One researcher muttered, they're treating the monitoring equipment as part of their environment. They're treating it as surveillance. Technology then corrected, look at how. They position themselves, they're making sure every camera has clear sight lines. Quorum settled into her observation chair, pulled up the monitoring feeds, and prepared to document everything. The cubs continued their routines, shift. Changes happened with mechanical precision. The larger cub, the one Devin had designated as security chief, yesterday made regular rounds checking on the others. Then Devin arrived for morning grooming. The cubs abandoned all protocol immediately, swarming her with excited chirps and playful tumbling. The security chief cub tried to maintain order, but even it couldn't resist when Devin started scratching behind ears. Fascinating, Quorum breathed, complete behavioral shift in response to specific individual. The human serves as a pack anchor despite species difference. She does their hair, I said. Quorum looked at me like I'd suggested the cubs had learned quantum mechanics. Their hair, grooming, fur styling. She's a hair stylist. A hairstylist has created the most advanced juvenile social structure I've ever documented, and you're telling me she did it by accident while performing cosmetic services? Yes. Quorum returned to her screens, muttering in 3 languages, none of which sounded complimentary. Devin set up her station, and the cubs lined up for their appointments. But today was different. Today the cubs had complex requests. Each one approached Devin, made a series of gestures, then showed her images on their data pads. Are those one? Researcher said slowly. Design specifications. They were. The cubs had spent the night creating detailed grooming plans, showing exactly what patterns they wanted, where they wanted them, how they styles should coordinate with their assigned ranks and duties. Devin examined each request with the same serious attention she probably gave to paying clients. Okay, this one's ambitious, but I can work with it. This one needs some modification or you'll get matting. This one is actually really creative. I like the asymmetry. She worked for 2 hours creating increasingly elaborate fur patterns. The cubs waited patiently, watching in the mirrors as she transformed each one, and with each completion the group's behavior shifted slightly. The cubs began organizing themselves by visual category, those with similar patterns grouped together, those with unique patterns took specific positions. They're creating a visible hierarchy. Quorum said, her voice tight, using aesthetic markers to denote social position. That's not supposed to develop until pack maturity. Henth, who had arrived early to observe Quorum's observation, pulled up his notes from yesterday. It gets worse. Watch what happens when she finishes. Devin completed the last grooming, stepped back and gestured at the mirrors. All 12 cubs moved to face their reflections in formation. Then they began making synchronized movements, complex patterns of gestures and positions that their reflections copied perfectly. Communication protocols, one researcher whispered. They're performing ritual exchanges. They're checking their outfits, Devin corrected, cleaning her brushes, making sure everything looks right from all angles. But the cubs didn't stop at checking. They continued their movements, making increasingly complex gestures, and I realized they were actually communicating something. The patterns had meaning, the positions conveyed information. One cub broke formation, approached, clears throat, Devin with a data pad. and set it at her feet with formal precision. Devin picked it up, scrolled through it, and nodded. Yeah, I can add that to the afternoon schedule. Good idea about the tail. Styling. What? Corm demanded, standing up so fast. Her chair fell over. Did that cub just do? Made a scheduling request. They want me to teach them advanced tailbreeding this afternoon. That cub just engaged in complex symbolic communication using a constructed gesture language to convey abstract concepts about future activities. Devin looked at the cub, looked at Corm, and shrugged. Yeah, they're pretty smart. The research team lost their minds for approximately 45 minutes. They ran every scan they had, analyzed every gesture, documented every interaction. The cubs tolerated this with remarkable patience, sitting still for scans while maintaining what I can only describe as Buste dignity. Their neural activity is off every chart. We have, one researcher reported, they're processing information at rates that shouldn't be possible for their age. They're forming complex associations, building predictive models, demonstrating theory of mind that exceeds some adult species. Can you explain this? Corm asked Devin directly. Kids are smart when you give them interesting problems. That's not an explanation. Sure it is. Devin gestured at the mirrors. They see themselves. They wonder about what they're seeing. They create a framework to understand it. The framework needs structure, so they build one. The structure needs rules, so they make them. The rules need enforcement, so they organize. It's just problem solving. Just problem solving, Corm repeated. They've constructed a complete governmental system in under 48 hours. Governments are just organized problem solving. I watched Corm's face cycle through about 12 emotions, none of them remotely calm. Henth was frantically taking notes. Queso had arrived at some point and was standing very still, probably calculating how much paperwork this would generate. That's when the cubs did something that made every researcher in the room stop breathing. The security chief cub approached the largest mirror, made a formal gesture, then turned and chirped a complex pattern. Every other cub responded in harmony. Then they split into groups, each group taking position at different mirrors, and they began what can only be described as a coordinated demonstration. One group at the main mirror, one group at the angled mirror, one group moving between them. They performed synchronized movements, each group's actions complementing the others, creating patterns that their reflections multiplied into infinity. They're demonstrating tactical coordination across multiple positions. Then said, that's not play, that's actual military drill. They're showing off. Devin said, they know everyone's watching, so they're performing their best work. One cub approached the angle point where the mirrors met, where reflections bounced endlessly between surfaces. It sat down precisely at that junction and made a long, elaborate series of chirps. Every other cub responded, their voices creating harmonics that resonated through the quarters. Then in perfect unison, all 12 cubs turned to face Corm, the security chief. Cub picked up a data pad, walked across the room with formal precision, and placed it directly in front of Corm's feet. Did that cub just? One researcher started, present a formal report. Another finished. Corm picked up the data pad with shaking hands. She read for 3 minutes in Complete silence, her ears flattened. Her tail went rigid. This is a governmental charter, she said. Finally, complete with constitutional principles, legal frameworks, and diplomatic protocols. 47 pages. She looked up at Devon. Did you teach them this? I taught them how to use a brush. How did they learn to write formal documentation? They've been watching station operations. Through the windows, watching you fill out forms, watching CAISO process. Requests, they're mimics. They see, they copy, they adapt. They're not copying, Quorum said, her voice rising. They're innovating. This document contains concepts I've never seen combined this way. They've created hybrid governmental structures that draw from multiple systems and synthesized them into something new. Kasia took the data pad, read it, and made a sound I'd never heard from her before. They're requesting formal recognition as a sovereign entity. They want embassy status, diplomatic immunity for their quarters, and regular negotiations with station administration. They're cubs, I said somewhat desperately. They're cubs who have organized themselves more effectively than some species do in their entire civilization. Development arc, Quorum countered. She turned to Devon. What else have you taught them? Mirror sign language, basic grooming. How to wait their turn, that's it. That's not a T. Quorum gestured at the cubs who had returned to their positions, maintaining their watch. Unwavering dedication. You've somehow triggered accelerated cognitive development that's rewriting everything we know about juvenile intelligence. Devon considered this. Neat. Neat, this is Quorum seemed to run out of words. That's when Devon did the thing that I'm pretty sure broke everyone's remaining sanity. She pulled a third mirror from her equipment case, a tall, narrow one. She positioned it perpendicular to the other two, creating a triangular arrangement that reflected reflections in 3 directions. Simultaneously, the cubs went absolutely silent. Every single one froze, staring at the new configuration, at the infinite reflections multiplying in impossible directions, at the geometric complexity of their own images, fractured across 3 surfaces. The security chief cub made one short, sharp chirp. In response, every cub moved, not chaotically, deliberately. They reorganized themselves into 3 distinct groups, one for each mirror. The groups established new patrol routes, new positions, new coordination protocols. They did this in under 3 minutes without apparent confusion, adapting their entire operational structure to accommodate the new dimensional complexity. Then the security chief approached. Devon made an elaborate gesture that involved all 4 paws in its tail and chirped a pattern that sounded suspiciously like gratitude. They just restructured their entire government, Henth whispered on the spot. In response to environmental change. Tridimensional alliance, Devon read from her data pad where the security chief had sent a message. They've named themselves, they're calling it the Tridimensional Alliance. Now, Quorum sat down heavily. I need to contact the Federation Scientific Council. This changes everything about juvenile development theory. You should probably contact them fast, I said, watching the cubs continue their reorganization, because I think they're planning to expand operations. The security chief cub had gathered 3 others and was showing them something on a data pad, plans. Diagrams. What looked suspiciously like territorial expansion proposals. Devon packed up her brushes completely. Unconcerned. Same time tomorrow, I was thinking about teaching them braiding techniques. No, 6 people said simultaneously. Devon looked at us, genuinely confused. Why not? Because Corm said, her voice strained. If you teach them one more thing they might accidentally invent. Interstellar travel. Devon laughed. The cubs continued their operations. Their reflections stared back from 3 directions, and I stood there watching my understanding of child development explode for the second time in as many days. Devon taught them braiding techniques. Of course she did, because when 6 experts tell a human not to do something, that human will absolutely do that thing, especially if they think it's helpful. She showed up the next morning with colored ribbons, styling clips, and what she described as just some fun accessories for the kids. The cubs treated it like she delivered advanced technological specifications. I watched colleagues as Devon demonstrated a simple 3-strand braid on one cub's tail fur. The cub observed intently, made several chirps, then turned to its reflection and performed the exact same braid on itself while watching the mirror. Perfect execution. First try. Within an hour, all 12 cubs could braid. Within 2 hours, they'd invented 4 new braid patterns Devon had never seen before. Within 3 hours, they'd established that different braids represented different diplomatic positions within their tridimensional alliance, and they were filing updated governmental documentation to reflect the new rank insignia system. I can't believe this, Corm said, watching her monitors. They're using decorative fiber manipulation as a complex symbolic language. They're doing braids, Devon said, working on the security chief's elaborate tail pattern. They've created a complete hierarchical identification system based on textile configuration. Complexity. Yeah, braids can be pretty complex. I had stopped trying to understand. I simply watched as the cubs transformed Devon's simple grooming lesson into what Corm's team was now calling the most sophisticated symbolic communication system ever developed by juvenile minds in recorded history. The cubs didn't stop at personal braids. They started braiding together, connecting their fur patterns across multiple individuals, creating linked designs that required cooperation and coordination. 3 cubs would sit together, braiding their tails into interconnected patterns, while their reflections copied the movements across 3 mirrors. Group bonding rituals, one researcher noted. They're using physical connection to reinforce social structures. They're having fun, Devon countered, but even she looked mildly surprised when the cubs presented her with a braided creation that involved all 12 of them, connected in a geometric pattern that somehow represented their complete governmental hierarchy in 3-dimensional fiber art. Corm requested an emergency meeting with Kesher and Station Command. I attended because apparently this was my life now. Corm brought her entire research team, 3 data pads full of documentation, and what I can only describe as evangelical fervor. We need to understand what we're witnessing, she began. These cubs have used a simple mirror as a catalyst for cognitive development that's approximately 8 years ahead of their species' normal progression. They've taught themselves abstract thinking, governmental organization, symbolic communication, and complex social structures all in 4 cycles. Using a hairstylist's mirror, Casual added using the mirror as a framework. Quorum corrected, the mirror provides them with immediate visual feedback. They see themselves, they see cause and effect, they understand that their actions have observable consequences. This creates a learning loop that accelerates their development exponentially. So the mirror made them smart, I asked. The mirror gave them a tool for learning how to be smart. Devin gave them structure and attention. The cubs did the rest themselves. Quorum pulled up her research data. I've been analyzing their governmental documents. They've independently invented concepts that match 7 different political philosophies, 3 distinct legal system frameworks, basic diplomatic theory that some species don't develop until they achieve space travel. They're 4 cycles old, Henth added. 4 cycles. Most predator cubs at this age are still learning not to eat their siblings. Kusha reviewed the documentation, her crest rising and falling repeatedly. What are you proposing? Official recognition, Quorum said, not of the cubs as a sovereign nation, obviously, but recognition of their quarters as an educational development zone. Let them continue their mere government as a supervised learning exercise. Document everything. This could revolutionize how we approach juvenile education across multiple species. You want to turn 12 cubs into an educational experiment. I said I want to learn from what they're already doing. They're not confused about the mirrors. Rex Tall, they know their reflections. They've known from the start. They're using the mirror as a framework for understanding abstract concepts like government, cooperation, and social organization. It's brilliant. It's beyond brilliant. It's the kind of accidental pedagogical discovery that comes along once in a generation. The station administrator pulled up the cubs' latest documentation. They're requesting Devin be appointed as creative development consultant. She still just does hair, Devin said from the doorway where she'd apparently been listening, but I'll supervise if you want. They're good kids, smart kids. They just needed something interesting to think about. Kasha made several administrative noises that suggested she was calculating forms and protocols and probably having stress responses that her species didn't have names for yet. Fine, she said finally. Educational development zone supervised learning exercise. Devin gets consultant status, which comes with a minor pay increase and requires no additional duties beyond what she's already doing. The cubs keep their mirrors and their government and their braids. We document everything, and if this somehow results in the cubs actually developing interstellar travel, I'm retiring. The cubs continued their operations. Over the following cycles, something remarkable happened. The cubs didn't abandon their government structure. They kept it, but their understanding evolved. They started acknowledging the mirrors as reflections while still maintaining their organizational framework. The government became a game they played, but a sophisticated game that taught them cooperation, communication, and creative problem solving. Quorum published 3 papers. Henth published 4. The Federation Education Council sent observers who watched in stunned silence as 12 cubs maintained complex social structures while also just being children who liked having their first styled and learning new Braids. They understand it's pretend now, Quorm explained to a visiting delegation. Several cycles later, but the pretending itself has value, they're learning. Through structured play, the mirrors give them immediate feedback, Devon gives them creative challenges, and they synthesize it all into learning. Experiences that would normally take years to develop. The Cubs graduated eventually to full mirror comprehension. They could explain exactly how reflections worked, could discuss angles and light properties, could even lecture about it with surprising accuracy. But they kept their tridimensional alliance. They kept their ranks and their braids, and their governmental charter. They became essentially the most organized youth group on the station. Other species' children started requesting mirror time for learning. Devon's grooming equipment became educational materials. Stations across 3 sectors started implementing reflective development tools based on Quorm's published research. And Devon continued doing hair. I found her several cycles later in the Cubs' quarters, which had been officially designated Educational Development Zone. 7 clears throat. The Cubs were older now, bigger there. Adult fangs growing improperly, but they still lined up for Devon's grooming. Sessions still requested specific braid. Patterns still maintained their government as elaborate social play. Vree's tail. Devon greeted me. Nita. Trim. I need to understand something, I said. Did you know this would happen? Did I know 12 traumatized Cubs would create a complete civilization using mirrors and grooming tools? No, that would be weird. Then what were you trying to do? She considered this, running her brush through the security chief's fur. The cub, nearly adolescent now, sat patiently, occasionally glancing at its reflection to check the grooming progress. I was trying to help kids who lost their pack feel like they had some control. Devon said simply, mirrors help with self-recognition. Self-recognition helps with self-confidence. Self-confidence helps with everything else. The Cubs just took it further than I expected, further than anyone expected. Kids do that. She finished the security chief's grooming, and the cub chirped gratefully before returning to its position. They're creative. You give them tools, they find uses you never imagined. That's what makes them kids. One of the younger Cubs approached her with a data pad showing a new braid design it had invented. Devon examined it seriously, suggested one modification, and the cub bounded away excited. By the way, Devon said, pulling out a small case, I brought my old makeup kit. Next week, thought I'd teach them about color theory and facial markings. Could be fun. I felt something break inside my brain. A small, important something that had been holding together my sense of what was educationally appropriate. Devon, I said carefully, what do you think will happen if you teach them color theory? They'll learn about color theory. They'll invent art-based communication systems. They'll create cultural traditions around facial markings. They'll probably develop aesthetic philosophy and beauty standards and possibly a complete artistic movement. Devon brightened. Oh, that would be cool. I had to leave. I had to go down. I had to process the fact that a hairstylist was going to accidentally teach 12 predator cubs to revolutionize artistic expression, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As I walked away, I heard one of the cubs chirp a question. Devon's response floated down the corridor. Sure, I can teach you about highlights. Next week, they're really fun with your fur color. I went to my office. I filed a report. The report was 17 pages long and contained multiple references to accelerated creative development through cosmetic education frameworks and somewhere in educational development. Zone 7, 12 cubs continued building their civilization, one braid at a time, guided by a human who just wanted to help children feel pretty. My colleagues, I have learned many things during my career in station security, but the most important lesson came from watching Devin and those cubs. Never underestimate what children can accomplish when you give them mirrors, patience, and someone who believes they're capable of greatness, even if that someone just cuts hair for a